In this video, we're going to take a look at how we can make this Mars-like terrain in Gaea 2.1. We'll start off with a ridge node to begin our terrain. You might have to play around with the scale a little bit, as well as the height and definition. And there's nothing really specific that we're trying to do here, but just get some interesting details into our surface. So changing the seed, and these are things you can also do later on as well, can help us kind of find a pattern that gives us a good start, or gives us the shaping of our terrain that we want later on. But one tip that also helps with that is I find clicking this button down here in the modifiers, the height remap, can also really help. You can use that to push your terrain much higher or lower. And in addition to that, there's another modifier here called shaper, where you can drastically change the way the terrain is pushing at different areas. And I find this another very useful control for getting some interesting shaping on our terrain. But once we have something like this, we probably have a pretty good start, and we can add our next node. Our next node is going to be an outcrops node, so I'll create that. And this will give us a lot of nice breakup to add a bit more detail into our terrain and make it feel very rocky. And this will be kind of the core or the base of our landscape. This is kind of defining all the underlying rocky structures, this outcrop node. And we have adjustments here for variation, strata, density, shape, and all that stuff can be adjustable to your liking. But just for now, I'll probably just play around with it, change them around, see what kind of look I get. And again, there's nothing really particular we're going for here. It's just about getting something that looks pretty good for the start of our terrain. Maybe density I'll go pretty high because I want to add a lot of break up into this ground structure. And then in addition to that, we also have our variation range where we could change a couple more things here, like the variation of these rocks. You can go lower, so there's smaller chunks, and keep the size just pulled back a little bit. So maybe I'll go here and kind of change some of the minimum and maximum size here. But really, all this stuff can be adjusted later closer to your liking. It's more about just getting the basic structures here. Now, the next node that we're going to add is going to be erosion to kind of smooth out this terrain. And I really like the erosion 2 node because it gives us a erosion scale, which actually gives us a lot of control to break up the look of this terrain. If I view this erosion 2 node by right clicking and kind of locking the preview or pressing F, we can change the duration. Like maybe right now I probably want to go with a little bit less than that duration. Down cutting, I probably want none. But erosion scale gives us a lot of control to change how the erosion acts at different scale levels or different kind of sizes. And that gives us a lot of control or flexibility to change how this erosion looks. So I really like that about this node, and I find myself using it quite a bit. And then again, seed doesn't really matter. You can just kind of play around with it till you get something that you find is interesting. And our terrain gets a bit softened out here. There's not too much else going on, but from here, I'm going to start breaking this terrain up more. I'm going to take the output of the erosion 2, and I'm going to do a craggy node. I'm also going to do a rockscape node, and then I'm also going to do maybe something to mask out craggy and rockscape from each other, something like a peaks node. So I create 3 nodes here, craggy, which looks like this, rockscape, and then peaks, which is the mask, which I'm going to use to blend these 2 things together. And this will give us a nice variation of breakup. So first of all, I might want to play around with some of these settings, like for craggy, maybe the size will go a lot higher. The depth, maybe I'll do something really small so it's not too steep. And then shape and seed, doesn't really matter. You can play around with it. But the point of this node is to get a lot of rock breakup. And then our rockscape node, the next node that we have here, is going to be giving us a lot of larger structures of these rocks. So same thing, I'm going to put size really high, erosion maybe really high, and just see kind of what that gives us. And if I preview this, we should kind of see what that gets. And maybe I've gone a bit too high here for erosion. I'll pull that a bit down, and same with size. Can't be 1, it kind of just wipes it out. But this is starting to look a bit better, 0.99. Put that lower, but I really want it to feel fairly broken up. And then surface, maybe I'll push up a bit more, see if we can get a bit more detail that surface or see what that does. Not really making too much of a difference, so probably doesn't really matter. But this is already starting to look pretty good. And then roughness, maybe, again, it doesn't really have too much of a impact when our size is at that amount. So this is probably good for now. But I have these two things, craggy and rockscape. And by having those two patterns and then our peaks, and the peaks, I'm going to really exaggerate this map. The fall off, I can maybe go a bit higher with. So to exaggerate this a bit more, what I like to do is go down here and I could invert it, first of all, to flip it, and then equalize to make it much more contrasted. And then I also like using the mask by height, and you can use that as a control to mask out different areas. So I could take kind of all the lower areas and then crop the height to be a little bit lower so I can mask away at some point. And it also gives us a nice fall off control that we can change here to control the fall off as well. But in this case, it's more about masking the height to kind of disappear so we can blend more of the craggy and the higher up areas and rockscape in the lower areas. So that's kind of our next step. Is what we're going to do is we will add a combine node, and we'll put the craggy into the first input, the rockscape into the second, and our peaks into the mask. And we'll preview that, do 100% blend on the blend mode. So is blending between those two things, craggy and rockscape, based on our peaks. And what we should get, you can see kind of here, we get our rockscape at the lower areas and our more craggy details like up here at the higher peaks. And that gives us some nice breakup. And this terrain still looks a little bit crazy right now, but that's where this next step comes in. What we're going to use is we're going to create a wizard 2 node. I like this node over erosion in some cases because it just simplifies things. It gives you a couple low, medium, high, ultra controls for all these different kind of attributes, power, depth, scale, deposits, flow, shape, detail. And I find that sometimes is a lot easier to work with. It takes away having too much control. So I can just go in here and look at this landscape now and start playing around with these and just comparing like power, low, medium. And I find this to be pretty powerful because I can just go through here and start changing these and just quickly get a feel for maybe what works best or maybe what is a nice combination. So what I can do is just start playing around with these and start to get a look that's kind of interesting. Like this is kind of nice now. We got a lot of these soft areas that are a bit more sandy. We still have some rock structures, and then higher up, we have these larger rock structures. So maybe this is already working pretty good with power at medium, depth at low, scale at high, deposits at low, flow as low, shape as high, and detail at medium. So that's working pretty well. So now what we can start doing is focus on adding a bit more details. Now, a quick and cheap and easy way of adding details to our landscape with Gaea 2 is using the debris node. So I really like this node because you can just drop debris on your terrain. And if you preview it, just adds like kind of these little rocks here and there. And maybe I'll up my resolution to 2K so I can see this a bit better. But what I'm going to do is emit this debris, but not just everywhere on the terrain. Before our wizard node here, what I can also do is take a height mask and I can just preview that. So I'm going to preview this height. And what I'm going to do is take a look at where we want to emit this debris from. So on the height node, I'm going to set the range to be the higher altitudes, maybe not the super low altitudes, and very soft fall off. So something like that. More debris will be emitted at the higher areas, and then it'll hopefully tumble down the terrain. So I'll use that as my debris emitter. I'll preview the debris. Generally with this debris, I do like the look of having it set to be natural instead of uniform for distribution. Sometimes I like to render the still rocks to rocks that don't move because it gives us some rocks in those lower lying areas. But generally, you have to use quite a high debris amount. So I'm going to change this to 32,000 just to get a lot of debris. And then amount multiplier, maybe I'll cut that down by half. So really, it's like almost like 16,000 debris. So you can use that multiplier to just nudge things around, but I'll up the friction a bit, and then restitution, how much speed it loses over time, or how quickly it comes to like a stop. Maybe I'll set that as 0.5 as well, and then size, I'll give it the full range. I'll go all the way up to 100 and maybe as low as 5, so you get a lot of variation of these pebbles and rocks. And maybe height on them, I'll just push up a little bit more so they're a bit more noticeable, a bit taller, and already that's looking pretty good. We have this nice distribution of rocks over our terrain. So not too bad, but we're starting to get a pretty good looking Mars-like surface. And now really it's all about coloring. There's more detail that we can add, but this already gives us a pretty good base. Now for our texturing, before I do that, I'll take my debris here and I'll use it as our underlay. And what I will do is next take the output, create a texture base. I'll give some good texture variations as a starting point. And again, some settings here: slope, flows, soil, patches, chaos. A couple things we can change here, even seed. I'll just play around with these, but I think I kind of want maximum flows. I want to get a lot of detail. Like I want to emulate sand on this environment, or very fine particulate kind of flowing around. And then soil's probably okay. Patches is probably okay. Maybe we can go a bit higher, like 0.6 or something. And then chaos, maybe I'll take some of that away just to keep it a bit sharper. But that gives me a good texture base. And then in addition to that, I'd also like to mask out the peaks. So I'll create a peaks node and I'll preview that. That gives us the peaks of some of these details on the terrain. And really for the fall off, I'll maybe just nudge this up a little bit so it's a bit brighter, maybe like 0.2 or something. And I think this is like an okay starting point of some masks to start getting texturing with our terrain, or kind of starting to blend those together to give us some more detailed breakup. Now, the next thing I really like to use here, which is also a fairly new node, is color erosion. It can get you a lot of nice details. So I'll connect our texture base up to color erosion. I can connect the height to our final 3D shaping node, and the precipitation I'm going to connect up to our peaks. And by doing that, I have this color erosion node that we can play around with the transport distance, sediment density, blend, color hold, flow volume, and whether we want laminar flow or not. You can see turning that on just makes it a little bit stronger and gives us more of these little flows with the center points, kind of more darker. It almost feels a little bit more detailed as well. So laminar flow is really just making it a little bit smoother for the most part. So I'll leave that on. And then we'll change our transport distance. And again, you can play around with these to just see what looks best in your opinion. So it's really personal preference, and depending on the type of landscape you're making, what gives you like nice patterns or breakups as well. But maybe something like this is pretty good. Sediment density, very high, blend, very high, and maybe flow volume, I can push up a little bit more, really smooth it out. You can see the difference of that. It's more kind of broken up and sharp, but I put this up to like 0.85 or something. It really starts to smooth it out. So already this is looking pretty good. Like I see a lot of these areas could maybe be colored with like a more sandy texture. And then really to top this all off, I'll take our color erosion node and I'll add an equalize just to make it really contrasted. Now, once I have that, I can probably already start texturing or shading our terrain. I'll take something like a sat map here, and that will give us some colorization to our terrain. Now I need to find something that looks like Mars. Might be hard to go through here and find that, so I'm not going to bother finding something exactly that works. I'm just going to go to the sand category. I'll cruise through here. I'll click on a couple things and maybe I'll find something that works. But really, I might just have to manually adjust it. So I'll go through here and just find something that has a good range of contrast, and I can play around with the bias to shift the colors or the values around. And I can even clip the kind of gradient here as well. I don't have to leave it as its default, or I could reverse it to flip it around. And maybe that looks a bit better. When I reverse it, I got these rocky chunks and then all these sandy areas as a different color. But this doesn't look like the sand that I want. So instead of trying to find exactly the right color gradient here, I can kind of cheat it a little bit. I can maybe offset the hue, crank up the saturation, and change the lightness as well, just to kind of force it into the kind of colors that I want. So that's something you can do as well. You don't have to find always the exact right color gradient. You could make your own gradient or choose colors and blend them. But in this case, this is quick and it works. And we can always adjust it a bit more later. And then to enhance, maybe I'll try out equalize or none and see how that changes things, but doesn't really make much of a difference here. Now maybe we can make this a bit better. It doesn't feel broken up enough. It feels a little bit bland. So one thing that we can also do before the sat map is I'll try enhancing this a bit. I'll use a weathering node. And if we look at our color erosion, I'm just going to go back so we can preview it. This is our color erosion. If I connect it to a weathering node, and then I set the height to be my height, but probably doesn't make too much of a difference here, and I preview that weathering node, it adds a very subtle difference. It adds some additional details into these areas. And those details are a bit small scale, but again, if we crank up the scale, maybe 0.99, creep I'll put to 0.5, and amount, let's just max it out. You can see we get all these lumpy dots in certain areas, so like before and now after. But we can have those kind of flow down into kind of flows of sand or pockets of sand by turning on washed out and also by turning on inverse. And now we kind of get these washed out pocket of sand areas. I'll even turn on darker and maybe just add some dirt value as well. But if we look at that now, this is before, after, it adds these pockets of sand in areas that might be helpful just to break it up a bit more. So if I add that now as the thing that my sat map uses, we get those extra pockets of more sand in some of those areas. And I find that just helps to break up the density or patterning of where that sand settles. So after we have that, we can add a few more details. Maybe what I'll do next is add one more weathering node. So I'll go here and add another weathering node. And I'll actually connect that up to our previous weathering node. And then the height, I'm going to connect up to our peaks. And that kind of gives me another one of these little blobs here, which is interesting. That could be used to add more rocky detail and things. But if I flop this, if I use the peaks as the input and the height from our weathering, I know our weathering's not meant for height here, but if I do that, it gives me a very good way to mask out a lot of the rocks. And it may not look like that right now, but if I take this second weathering node with the input connected to peaks and the height connected to my previous weathering node, if I apply similar settings where I inverse this, darken it, add a bit of dirt here, maybe 0.7 for the dirt, and a high scale, 0.99, and a high amount, well, now we get like an interesting kind of map on all these kind of rocky or rigid areas that are kind of on these slopes as well. Like if we look at our sat map here, these higher up flows of sand, I kind of get those masked out, as well as a lot of these other rocky areas. So if I preview, you get those rocky areas kind of masked out in more of like a patchy pattern. So that's something that can be useful as well. You don't always have to put height, like your terrain height, into the weathering node. You can experiment with other things as well. And by doing this, if I were to take this a step further, create another sat map node, connect that new weathering node, and just get some sort of rocky texture. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but maybe rock. And we just scroll through here and look for something that's kind of like dark. This is probably fine. Maybe I do a bit of a bias offset, but not really anything I have to spend too much time on. For now, we could fine tune that a bit later. But if I now combine this sat map with the sandy and rock, and then this darker, much more rocky color. If I combine those two, so first sat map to the first input, second sat map to the second input, and then for the mask, I'm just going to use the weathering node that I have here already. So it goes in only those rocky areas. We now get control over these darker rocks in some areas, so it gives us a bit of breakup or variation, and it'll just do the ratio blend to 100%. So it just gives us a bit of a variation. Some darker rock in lower areas that are maybe more exposed, and then some higher up rock that's kind of a different color. So you can kind of use that to break things up a bit further. And then finally, to add a little bit more detail to the landscape, I just want to have the sand be a little bit brighter in some areas. Right now, it all feels the same color. It all feels very monotone, and that doesn't really help it look any better. So what I'm going to do is add one more combine node. And on this combine node, I'll take our previous combine node. I'll do an additive kind of blend. And what I will do is create a flow node. And I'm going to connect that flow to our final 3D shaping node. In this case, it's our debris. And it looks something like this for our flow node. And we'll have to change around some of those settings. Maybe the flow length, I go pretty high to make more longer noticeable flows. Flow volume, probably okay where it is. I could try playing around with the seed, but already that adds a lot of detail. And if I just plus that on top and put it into our combine there, it just adds a little bit brighter sandy flows on some areas, which makes it look a little bit more interesting. So we start to get something that feels a bit more detailed, and maybe the ratio, we pull it down. We don't need it to be too strong, maybe something like 30% or 0.3. And then we start to get some brighter areas. And now we can go back and fine tune our color and fine tune some of these maps, but we start to have a bit of our landscape texturized as well. So now to finally do the cleanup or a little bit of final touches for this, we'll go back to the sat map that's our darker rock. I think that rock's getting a bit too dark. So maybe I go there and I just take saturation down. I'll throw the lightness higher, set it to equalize or something. And maybe that sits in a lot better now. Still has some variation, still adds some variation, but definitely looks a lot more suited to the landscape and not as dark. And then maybe for our other sat map as well, if I take a look at it, we can, inch the bias up a bit more, see how that changes it, and kind of play around with that to see if we want more rocky, more sandy, or whatever kind of pattern we want. Even playing around with the roughness can give us some breakup. The edges are a bit too sharp, kind of soften things out. So we can do those slight tweaks and adjustments. And then one thing to also keep in mind is just going back and maybe changing some of our 3D nodes if we don't like the distribution of rock or something like that. Once we have this set up, it's not really a finished product, but it's a good base to start using. And then we can always go and adjust it. Like if I go all the way back to the very beginning in my ridge node here, if I decide like, you know what, actually I don't like how this shape is up here in the top left corner, I can start making adjustments. I can shift those details. I can go to the scale X and I can just tile those details more, add a bit more into here. Maybe I do something like 1.4 something. It just adds in some details. Now it feels like I have too many details that way. Let's change the Y scale, maybe 1.91. Okay, now the terrain's a little bit more interesting. It has this big ridge here. It's more broken up. That scale control for X and Y is really useful. And by just doing that and then playing around with the height remapping that I talked about a bit earlier, maybe even going down here and changing the shaper as well that I talked about earlier, we can get a totally different pattern here. And then if we follow that all the way through, we regenerate our whole network here, we can get a totally different look of our terrain. And then playing around with your lighting as well, like shifting the sunlight at different angles, different times of days, just so you can see how the shapes of your terrain are reacting with the light and the shading that you have to make sure you're creating things that look good in different lighting situations as well. So playing around with that light is important. Aiming it top down gives you a very flat look that's sometimes useful to work with. And then just putting it at different angles will let you see kind of the terrain with more shading on it. So we start to get to see how those cliffs and crevices and how the height of our terrain responds with the light. And that's very useful as well. So you can always go and change your terrain once you have it created. Like maybe I don't like this edge here. Well, that's okay. I can just go all the way back to my ridge, maybe put the scale to 0.88 or 0.9. It will scale it up a bit, so it'll push out those edges, and I'll have a terrain that I'm more happy with. So adjusting some of those earlier nodes are not a problem once you've built up the system, because it's just going to regenerate everything following the same procedural steps, giving you a very similar look, retaining kind of our style of our terrain, but just giving us different shaping of the terrain. And maybe one final thing to keep in mind throughout this process is don't be afraid to work backwards. So just as an example of how that can be useful, if I take something like an occlusion node and connect that up to my terrain, and I'm not going to bother playing with the settings, but if we have something like this, it's almost just a gray pattern without any really much texture here. But if we start working backwards, like using a combine and minusing away, so I can take this occlusion and subtract 100% of my flow, and then maybe subtract again 100% of my second weathering node, and then maybe subtract again 100% of my first weathering node. You can start to get interesting patterns, and then you can start playing around with those. Maybe instead of subtract on this final one, I do something like exclusion, and we get these interesting shapes here. And then if I combine my final color with this, and this is just very simply combining it on top and previewing what that does with a blend, but if I set that to maybe something like multiply and I push it up, we can get some interesting patterns here. Or perhaps set it to some of these other blend modes and get some nice variation. So you can also play around with those adjustments. And maybe with this here, with this exclusion, I add a bit of a equalize to strengthen it even more. And now look at this. We have this very rocky breakup. Maybe 100% combined is too much, but I can pull that back and get a very different looking terrain very easily and use that as a way to texturize things. Maybe it doesn't have to be everywhere. You know, I could go in here now and take a slope node and mask it out so it's just affecting maybe some of those higher angled areas or steeper areas. So maybe for that slope range, I kind of limit it to very specific areas. But this gives us an idea of how working backwards can also be useful for adding a lot of textural detail. So don't always be stuck on trying to do things going forward, but try starting with a pattern and minusing from it as well. And a lot of the time that can get us really interesting patterns that you might have not come across very easily. If you enjoyed this video or you learned something new, don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you're part of the Patreon, which you can find a link to down in the description below, you'll get access to the PDF for this video that goes over all the steps we went over in this video in a little bit more detail, as well as the Gaea files to this landscape and a couple other samples.